So on June 22nd of 1864, this once 600-acre farm was witness to a disastrous Confederate attack that resulted in almost 1,500 Confederate casualties. But why here? Well, that's what we're here to find out. On the night of June 18th of 1864, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston moved into a defensive position on Kennesaw Mountain here in Georgia. Wanting to avoid a frontal attack against an entrenched enemy, Major General William T. Sherman would extend his line in an attempt to envelop the Confederate flank with Major General John Schofield's Army of the Ohio. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston countered by moving Lieutenant General John B. Hood's corps from his right flank to his left flank on June 22nd. Hoping to flank Schofield, Hood would attack, moving down the Powder Springs Road towards the farm of Peter Kolb, 5 days prior to the main battle here on Kennesaw Mountain. So what you're seeing here would have been the farmhouse for Peter Kolb. Now, this area is just a little sliver of history now, but back in June of 1864, Peter Kolb's farm would have been nearly 600 acres in this general area. So we mentioned that Sherman wanted to avoid a frontal assault. So he wanted to outflank the Confederate force. So he sent Major General John Schofield's army in this general area. Now to counter that, Johnston dispatched Hood, and Hood would go from the Confederate right to the Confederate left. Now, thinking that he could outflank the Union himself, Hood would launch a frontal assault. So this is the Powder Springs Road. Now this road was here during the time of the battle. It obviously wasn't as busy, but he would launch his assault, 3 divisions, and they would come directly at us at the camera here. And I'm going to pan to my left. In this location, I would say a couple hundred yards, the Union would entrench their forces a couple hundred yards in this direction. So early in the morning on June 22nd, the Confederates sent out skirmishers in this area where they were captured. And in turn, the Union knew the attack was coming, so like we just stated, they began entrenching their forces back in this direction a couple hundred yards. So they were ready. Now, at around 4 p.m. on June 22nd of 1864, Hood would launch his assault. So you had nearly 11,000 Confederates advancing towards this general area here. Now keep in mind, Hood was commanding 3 divisions, so think about how big those divisions are. Within those divisions, you have 3, 4, sometimes 5 brigades. You had Confederate forces all along this area here. And actually in front of the Union lines was a handful of regiments acting as skirmishers. Occupying this area would have been the 14th Kentucky. Panning to my left, and you also had skirmishers in this area from the 123rd New York. So imagine being a skirmisher in a single regiment, and there are 3 Confederate divisions bearing down this location here, and put yourself in the shoes of one of those soldiers. Now the 14th Kentucky was under the command of Colonel George Gallup, and they would have occupied this area, and they weren't in your traditional line of battle. What they did was they deployed unconventionally, at least for this time. Now they would have taken a position behind a fence similar to the one you're seeing here, behind some of these trees, rocks, anything that they can do to amplify their firepower and cover. Let's keep in mind, you have an entire division under the command of Major General Carter Stevenson deployed and coming straight at us here. So his division, consisting of numerous brigades, stretched a couple hundred yards in each direction here. And think about a single Union regiment in this location. You're thinking a couple hundred men at the most at this time in the war. So think about what the men of the 14th Kentucky who are holding this position, think about what's going through their minds as thousands of Confederate forces are bearing straight at them. Now, let's think about something real quick. We're a soldier in the 14th Kentucky. We're positioned on our fence line. Behind me are 2 Confederate brigades in Stevenson's division bearing right for us. The 14th Kentucky, positioned here, waited until the Confederates were within 30 feet before opening fire. And they would release a volley, dropping scores of Confederate forces just ahead of us here. And the attack actually started to bog down here. Keep in mind, you have 2 Confederate brigades assaulting 1 Union regiment here, and they were starting to get bogged down, which in turn derailed Hood's plans of turning the Union right.
We were in the midst of one of the fiercest battles of the war, a perfect torrent of lead and iron. Major John McGuire, 32nd Tennessee.
Now, another factor playing into the Confederate disaster here was the Union artillery. So naturally, again, they were back in this area behind makeshift breastworks, but the Union artillery was zeroed in on this location. And as Confederates were advancing all along this front here, keep in mind the 123rd New York is doing what the 14th Kentucky is doing in this location, but the Union artillery was hammering the advancing Confederate divisions here.
Crashing through the long lines of the enemy go the solid shot. Now screaming and yelling goes a broadside of shells, tearing and smashing into solid columns, who stagger and waver before it. Yet the brave rebels press on. Why do they dare come further into such a hot hail of lead and iron, but hear that cracking, rattling, hissing volley from the cannon as stands of canister shot go sowing death among the enemy, yet they still advance. Sergeant Henry Morehouse, 123rd New York.
Like a tornado, volley after volley were sent plunging and tearing through the massed lines, strewing the ground with fallen men. It was a magnificent range for canister, and the effectiveness of the gunners' aim was made terribly manifest. They trembled under the awful fire. Theodore Tracy, 19th Ohio Battery.
So like we mentioned earlier in the video, the Kolb family had a 600-acre farm in this area, and they just happened to be caught in the middle of these 2 armies here. So the house was essentially caught in the middle of this fight here, and it did sustain some damage. Now, it was altered after the war, and I believe in 1964, the house was restored to its original appearance like you're seeing today. But that's just a brief little snapshot about the Kolb family here, and you can probably bet that they didn't expect to find themselves smack dab in the middle of 2 armies here, and the battle was unfolding literally on their farm in this general area.
This engagement was a disgrace to the officer who planned it and showed an amount of ignorance of the enemy's position and the difficulties to be overcome before he could be reached, for which there could be no excuse. Brigadier General Arthur M. Manigault, Hood's Corps, CS Army.
Now, following this disastrous attack by Hood, he lost 1,500 men killed, wounded, and captured just in this area before us. 2/3 of those casualties were from Stevenson's division that were coming through this area here. Now, following the battle, the Kolb House here became Major General Joe Hooker's headquarters. And although there isn't much left of this property, it was still pretty neat to come out and share this little sliver of history with you. So, like I always say, we're going to catch you on the next one.
The rebels had crowded behind this for protection, but were literally mowed down. The torn, bloody knapsacks, haversacks, and frequent pools of blood were ghastly evidences of how they suffered. The stream was choked up with bodies and discolored with blood. In the ravine and around the house where they had crowded for shelter, their bodies lay piled on one another.